Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I assume you can hear me okay. It looks like I'm being properly amplified. I am going to talk about an affair of honor that took place in London between Christopher Gore during his service on the Maritime Claims Commission and a man named George W. Erving. And I did want to point out to begin that Gore's service on that Maritime Claims Commission, stemming from Article 7 of Jay's Treaty, was tremendously significant. That arbitration commission was the grandfather of all interstate arbitration commissions from the 18th century to the present day. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of them, and they all begin with that commission under Article 7 of the Jay's Treaty. So we owe a lot of tribute to Gore for his service on that commission. He and his fellow commissioners did an exemplary job, not just the Americans, but also the British commissioners, in establishing the basic principles that govern most arbitrations to this day. But it was while he was serving there that something went wrong that became an affair of honor and almost a duel. And the reason duels sometimes happened was, as you'll see, somebody would insult somebody else, and that person would demand satisfaction because, after all, you can't stand up to and permit that kind of insult and maintain your character as a gentleman, maintain your respect in the community that you're a part of. So unless you get some sort of satisfaction short of a duel, it could come to what might be a murderous encounter somewhere beyond the city limits of wherever you happen to be. And the next slide depicts the typical dueling posture. Just so you know, if this ever happens to you, if you're in a duel, you want to kind of go like this. You don't want to be like that, but like this. Just a very, very small sliver of your body ought to be presented to whomever you are confronting at a duel. Some of these could be very serious. Your typical duel would involve a ritual of letters back and forth that might take place over a few days or even weeks. And Gore's near duel with George Erving was like that, but some of them were much more ridiculous than that duel. For example, consider what happened in 1803, the very same year that the Gore-Erving altercation almost resulted in pistol shots. This was a duel that happened in April of 1803 after one Colonel Robert Montgomery was riding down Rotten Row in Hyde Park on his horse. Has anybody ever heard of Rotten Row? Heard of Rotten Row? Good. Rotten Row was where you went horse riding if you wanted to be seen and see in society in the early 19th century in London. It was the very first public path in England to be artificially lit. And they called it Rotten Row because it was founded by William III of England. So people called it Route de Roi, Route of the King. So that became Rotten Row, easily corrupted that way to English tongues. So anyway, here's Montgomery. He's a colonel in the British infantry. Colonel Montgomery, April 6th, 1803, was riding his horse down Rotten Row, followed by his beloved Newfoundland wolf dog, who happened to be named Wolf. Riding towards him was the captain in the Royal Navy. This guy's name was McNamara, accompanied by his own Newfoundland dog, which, according to some sources, was named Caesar. Wolf and Caesar failed to get along with one another. They snarled and they began to fight. And Montgomery, the infantry officer, yelled to McNamara, "If you do not call off your dog, I will knock him down," threatening poor Caesar. McNamara objected to this, called Montgomery arrogant, and Montgomery said, "It is not my intention to quarrel, but if your dog falls on mine, I must knock him down." By now, Wolf and Caesar had ceased to fight. And after exchanging cards, Montgomery and McNamara rode away. They went their separate ways. And nothing should have come of this, except, unfortunately, they met later that same afternoon at St. James Church at Piccadilly. And Wolf and Caesar went back to fighting. And Montgomery got upset, and Montgomery said, "You got to call off your dog." McNamara objected to being instructed what to do with Caesar. So McNamara began shaking his stick at Montgomery, and Montgomery didn't like that one bit. So Montgomery challenged him to a duel to take place a little bit outside of London, right outside the city limits. So there they were within 2 hours of Wolf and Caesar's fight, and they're pointing pistols at one another. Within just a few yards, I think only 6 yards, which was a very small space for assailants to be separated by in a duel. Montgomery was the challenger, so he fired first, defending Wolfe's honor, presumably, and he missed. McNamara, captain of the Royal Navy, fired next, and he missed. At this point, the rules of duels were pretty clear. The seconds at this point should have stepped in. When you're going to be in a duel, you always have a second. And one of the duties of a second is to know when honor has been satisfied. So both of you have fired at each other. You both missed. The whole thing is stupid anyway. Let's all walk away from this. Your reputation for bravery has been satisfied for both of you and upheld. So let's call the whole thing off. But the seconds didn't do that. And so Montgomery and McNamara fired at each other again. And this time Montgomery was killed by McNamara, all because of a dogfight in Regent's Park. I think it was Regent's Park, right? Rotten Row? I think so. Hyde Park. Let's call it Hyde Park. Okay. So this is pretty serious. McNamara had just killed a human being, and that's homicide. Even then, in the early 19th century, that's homicide under the common law of England. So they brought him up for trial on manslaughter, and McNamara was going to be found guilty. He couldn't really defend himself. He'd actually shot at Montgomery and killed him. But what he told the jury was what duelists usually said. In those rare occasions in America, when they were ever brought before a jury, here's what they always said. It doesn't matter what the law says. The laws of honor and gentlemanly conduct demanded that I protect my honor. I would never be of use in the Royal Navy again if I had a reputation of cowardice. That's why I had to accept the duel. That's why I had to rise up to this challenge. But he needed a character witness to vouch for his good faith in all this. And the year is 1803. Guess who his character witness was? He's in the Royal Navy. He actually got Horatio Nelson to come in and vouch for his reputation as a captain, and a very good captain. You're not going to convict if Horatio Nelson says you're a good guy. So the jury let him go, and McNamara would serve very capably for the next decade or so in the Napoleonic Wars. By the way, the law here in Massachusetts was also that dueling is murder. If you kill somebody in a duel, that's murder, pure and simple. And the law in Massachusetts also was, even if you didn't kill anybody in a duel, if you participated in a duel, that itself was a crime, and you could be subject to 39 lashes for participating in a duel. Anybody know why they would give you 39 lashes? This is your chance to shine as a biblical scholar, because in the Old Testament, that was the limit of lashes that you could administer to a servant, 40 lashes, no more. So the rule in Massachusetts and elsewhere was no more than 39 lashes, because they were afraid that they would lose count and they give somebody more than 40. So they decided on 39, and that was the rule, and that's what you get if you participated in a duel. And if you died in a duel, or you killed somebody in a duel and you were executed for it, they would bury you in a crossroads after plunging a stake through your chest. The same thing they would do to suicides, and for the same reason, because suicide was thought as something that came from the instigation of the devil, and the same thing was true about dueling, and that's why they would administer that kind of punishment to you. Now, those dogs snarling at each other in Hyde Park was one way a duel might happen, but the other way they happen more customarily is through a series of letters that ultimately would prove, at least to the seconds and to the people involved, unavailing in terms of a peaceful solution. And something like that almost happened with Christopher Gore and George Erving. So now let's turn to that story. That, of course, is the Newfoundland dog. We can leave him aside for a second. The story has to do, in a way, with Rufus King, Christopher Gore's great friend, Rufus King, who grew up in Scarborough, Maine. Rufus King and I have intersecting lives in many ways, because I went to college in Madison, Wisconsin, and I lived just down the street from King Street, named after Rufus King. And my mother grew up in Kingfield, Maine, named after the brother of Rufus King, William King, the first governor of Maine. And here he is again. So the year is 1801. Rufus King was minister to England. This is the 5th year of Gore's service on the Maritime Claims Commission. They had always been friends. They were still very good friends in London. And Gore was very upset when King decided to go home. Jefferson had been elected president. King understood he, as a Federalist, wasn't going to last long at this job anyway. Jefferson was going to appoint somebody else pretty soon. King decided not to wait around for that. and he decided just to go home. And that's what he did in 1803, leaving Christopher Gore, 44-year-old Christopher Gore, in charge of the American mission in London. So we would now call him charge d'affaires. And that's what he now assumed the duties as when Rufus King went home in 1803. Now, that was an obvious choice. Christopher Gore was very well known in London, very well respected in the diplomatic community there, living at his place on Great Cumberland Place in London. As caretaker minister, he would promise to do a very good job, which in fact he did, but not everybody was happy about it. And the person who was unhappy about it was that guy there, 10 years younger than Gore. That's George W. Erving, who in 1802 became American consul in London. What he was doing, that was part of his duties anyway, is represent American ship owners and insurance companies as they made claims in front of Christopher Gore's Maritime Claims Commission for monies owing to them from British depredations on American shipping. So Erving, as counsel, would handle those cases, and Gore thought he was terrible at it. Gore thought he was lazy. He didn't know what he was doing. And now, to make matters worse, Rufus King had gone home, and George Erving, as our consul in London, thought he should have been charge d'affaires, not Gore. The two were now very much at loggerheads. And in fact, Erving told Gore that you can contact me in your capacity as a Maritime Claims Commission member. If that's how you want to contact me, that's fine. I'll respond to you. But Erving told Gore, don't even think of approaching me in a capacity as charge d'affaires or acting minister, because if that's what you do, I'm not even going to respond to you. I'm going to ignore you. He had the cheek to tell Christopher Gore that. These two were not getting along at all. Erving was an old Massachusetts guy. His father was a loyalist who left shortly after Howe evacuated Boston. George W. Erving grew up in England, went to the University of Oxford, liked it in England, but his heart was always across the ocean in North America, and he became a Jeffersonian Republican, which is why he was the new American consul in London as of 1802. So now we come to the events that almost gave rise to a duel between these two guys, Gore and Erving, who didn't like one another one bit anyway. The sequence of events begins with a series of letters that Christopher Gore, beginning in 1802, while Rufus King was still there in London, to William Eustace. So there's William Eustace. William Eustace was a doctor. He treated the wounded after the Battle of Bunker Hill, served with the Army for a while, best known for one particular patient that he treated in 1780 when Peggy Shippen Arnold found out that her husband Benedict was a traitor. She ran upstairs in hysterics and could barely be comforted. We now think she was probably faking it. But the person who did comfort her was the doctor, William Eustace, and he did that at West Point in 1780. Then went back to Massachusetts. He knew Christopher Gore. They were friends. They served in the state legislature together for a while. And this is long before Eustace became the worst Secretary of War in American history, which he became just in time to almost lose the War of 1812. But that's all the way in the future. We're talking about him now. It's only 1802. Eustace was back in North America, serving as the newly elected representative in Congress from Boston. So the Jeffersonian Republicans had won this election against the odds, against the Federalists, and Eustace was now in Washington, and Gore knew that. And the way we know Eustace now, of course, is that it's his house in Roxbury, famous as the Eustace Shirley House. That's the family, and that's the man. And this whole sequence of events would arise because of this friendship. Gore and Eustace were old friends. Gore trusted Eustace. And so Gore felt free to write Eustace about George W. Erving. And what Gore thought was that if he told Eustace, his old friend in Washington now, that Erving was no good, couldn't be trusted, incompetent, doesn't know what he's doing in front of the Claims Commission, then what Eustace would do would probably be something like this. Eustace would take these letters from Gore, talking about what a bad consul Erving was, and then what Eustace would do is go to Jefferson. He had Jefferson's ear, or maybe Madison, the Secretary of State, or maybe somebody else influential among Republicans in Washington, and tell them, I'm hearing complaints about Erving. Maybe he's not up to the job. Maybe he should be replaced without bringing Gore's name into it, because that's what a friend would do. Act on the friend's request without implicating the friend in what might be, if things went awry, a dangerous affair of honor. So here's what Gore did. He wrote Eustace. He said, Erving cannot even do a minimally competent job. According to Gore, Erving was incapable of rendering any useful service at all as our consul. He is guilty, according to Gore, quote, of ignorance, pride, and conceit. And one of the things Gore didn't like about Erving was one of these guys, but some of you know somebody like this, if you work at an office. Gore and the other people on the Claims Commission, like his friend William Pinckney and Jonathan Trumbull, they would ask Erving, as somebody who would represent the claimants, for a document. We need to see this document. Can you copy the document? We need to look at it here on the Claims Commission. And what Erving would do is he would tell the clerks working for him, you go find like 20 or 30 documents that are like that document, copy all of them, let them find the right one. So he was making work for the clerks. He copied all these documents, sent them over to Gore and Pinckney, and they have to wade through all of them. Is this the one you want? Is this the one we want? And he did that purely to annoy them. And it got to the point by 1802, Gore wouldn't ask Erving for anything. They were barely on speaking terms, if that. Unfortunately, after Gore, in a series of letters, I talked about how awful Erving supposedly was as our consul. Eustace turned out not to be the friend that Gore thought he was. They'd known each other for 15 years. They were they weren't really carouse, I suppose, but they would be convivial together. Gore talked in the letters about how much he valued Eustace's friendship. Gore would say, you know I'm a Federalist. I know you're a Republican. We could still get along. We could still approach each other as friends. But that's not really how Eustace saw this. Eustace saw this as a way to ingratiate himself with his fellow Republicans in Washington. So here's what Eustace did. He didn't keep Gore's name out of it. Instead, he took Gore's letters to General Samuel Smith, newly elected senator from Maryland, and the man to whom Jefferson owed the White House, because Samuel Smith had convinced the Delaware delegation to vote for Jefferson over Burr in the famous contested election of 1801 in the House of Representatives. So Smith was also the younger brother of Robert Smith, the Secretary of the Navy. Samuel Smith was a big deal. So now Gore, although he didn't know this, had just written to a man who took those letters and showed Samuel Smith with Gore's name on all the letters. And then what Samuel Smith did he show Jefferson the letter? Did he show Madison the letters? We don't quite know. He might have. But we know what he did do. He showed the letters to a guy named Gabriel Christie. Gabriel Christie, ladies and gentlemen, another Maryland politician, friend of Samuel Smith, another Jeffersonian Republican. Gabriel Christie, the man who introduced Thomas Jefferson to that. That's the Alexander grape. That is the first grape in America to give rise to a wine industry, the first commercially produced grape in America, the origin of the fantastic American wine industry, which we all enjoy today. It's all because of that grape, the Alexander grape, which, as you all know, is a mixture of Vitis vinifera and Vitis labrusca. And it was Christie who told Jefferson about it. We owe that to him. But the other thing that is important about Christie is he decided to write back to Erving about everything that was now going on. So here's essentially what happened. Christie, who knew Erving, Christie wrote a letter across the Atlantic to George W. Erving, enclosing part of a letter from Samuel Smith to Christie talking about what Gore was talking about in regard to Erving. So Christie sends a letter to Erving. There's a little enclosure from Samuel Smith. And in the letter, Christie says, I just thought you'd want to know that Gore is trying to injure you here in Washington. So according to Christie, Smith had written him, that Gore had written Eustace, that Erving was inattentive to his duties as American consul, and in addition to that, suffered from pride, conceit, and want of knowledge. He is endeavoring to do you much injury, said Christie to Erving, and all that was perfectly true. Gore had used some pretty insulting expressions in those letters. That's all true. The question now was, what was to become of this? And I guess one good thing to point out is there may be a question about what Gore's motives were. Why would Gore do this? Why would Gore try to get Erving recalled? And after looking into this quite extensively to the extent that I can, I really think his motives were simply that he wanted the Maritime Claims Commission to succeed. And Erving, representing the claimants, was simply not doing a good job coming up with the evidence and making the arguments that the commission could work with. And I think Gore really did want somebody new in that position who'd do a better job and would make the country look a bit better, perhaps. So by 1802, 1803, I think that was Gore's thinking. But if that was Gore's thinking, it wasn't going to be as simple as that, because Erving was not going to be recalled. And in fact, Erving was really going to resent what he now learned from Christie, which, of course, is that Gore was talking about him behind his back and insulting him to people who mattered, like Eustis in Washington. So now what was going to happen is the various steps in an affair of honor would now begin. What Erving now knew is that Gore had insulted him to a third party, maybe several third parties. And when that happened, what you did, if you were in Erving's position, was sit down and write a nice, well-composed letter setting out the insulting expressions that this person was said to have used about you and asking for an explanation. Is it true you use those expressions? Is there any explanation you can offer for this? And you would always entrust that letter to a person. You wouldn't put that in the mail. You'd entrust that to a person who is now your second. Erving now had a second. His name was Upshaw, a friend of his in London. And on April 6th, 1803, James Upshaw, acting on Erving's behalf, delivered a letter, part of which is on the board, in which Erving enclosed the relevant sentiments from Smith's letter that he had gotten enclosed in Christie's letter about what Gore had said about him, noting that although if the average person had said something like this, I wouldn't care, but you are in your official capacity, you're telling things about me that reflect badly upon me in your official capacity. I can't tolerate that. And what he ended the letter was this: a proper regard for my character, said Erving, a proper regard for my character compels me to require complete and satisfactory reparation. So as soon as he said that, complete and satisfactory reparation, that means he's looking towards a duel. If he doesn't get a good explanation for those remarks, if they're not explained away somehow, then this is going to come perhaps to a duel. And that's the letter that Gore got on April 6th. He was now on notice that Erving considered this an affair of honor. He can't walk away from it, just as Alexander Hamilton would be on notice the next year in 1804 that Aaron Burr considered this an affair of honor when he demanded an explanation for Hamilton's supposed remarks that Burr was guilty of something despicable. Well, what was it? You got to explain yourself, and if you don't, we resort to the pistols. Now, what you could do if somebody accused you of saying something bad about them, something insulting to their character or reputation, is you could just admit it and say, yeah, I said it, which means it's time to pick out the pistols. And that's what happened in 1777 during the Revolution. Button Gwinnett, signer of the Declaration of Independence down in Georgia, had called a militia officer, Lachlan McIntosh, to a third party, a scoundrel and a lying rascal. McIntosh heard that he'd been called a scoundrel and a lying rascal, so he wrote a letter to Button Gwinnett, McIntosh did, and asked, did you call me a scoundrel and a lying rascal? And Gwinnett wrote back, yes, indeed, I did. I called you a scoundrel and a lying rascal. And so the next morning, after that letter got back to McIntosh, Gwinnett and McIntosh met on the dueling ground. The seconds were there, everybody was prepared. And Gwinnett was indeed fatally shot after facing each other with pistols. I'm not sure why he's grabbing his chest. He was shot there. He was shot in the knee. And he died of his wounds. And that's why Button Gwinnett's signature, less than 1 year after the Declaration of Independence, is so valuable. Does anybody know what you can pay for Button Gwinnett's signature the last time that went on market? You can pay, if you want to, $10,000 for a Franklin signature, $10,000 for a Jefferson signature, but you got to pay $800,000 for Button Gwinnett. because he died so shortly after the Declaration, and there aren't that many signatures of his. Well, this whole thing with Gore and Erving was a little bit different. Gore could have just admitted it, but that's coming dangerously close to inviting a duel. And Gore's going to try to find a way around that. He wants perhaps to avoid it if he can, as we'll see. So what you could do is perhaps prevaricate a little bit, try to explain it away, not exactly deny having said it, but try to put it in some context. Maybe those weren't my exact words. I can't remember. Could be I said it. I'm not really sure. And that's what some duelists tried to do. For example, in 1820, this Commodore James Barron, he had heard that Stephen Decatur, famous naval officer, was walking around Norfolk, Virginia, telling people that he could insult Barron all he wanted and Barron would do nothing about it. That's what Decatur had been saying. Barron heard that, wrote back Decatur, "It has come to my ears that you've been walking around Norfolk saying that no matter what bad things you say about me, I would never challenge you. Is that true?" And Decatur wrote back a note basically saying, "I'm not sure I quite said that. But yeah, I said something along the same lines." And that wasn't good enough for Barron. He called him a coward, of course. And so there was going to be a duel. No other way to explain it. And they met in Bladensburg, the famous dueling ground outside of the District of Columbia, always known as the Valley of Chance, because there were so many duels there. There were actually 50 duels in Bladensburg, which you either survived, of course, or you didn't. So it's called the Valley of Chance. Barron and Decatur, usually if this was a duel, they would march off 10 paces or 12 paces and then shoot from that distance. This time it was only 8 paces. And the reason it was only 8 was that Barron was nearsighted. And he wanted to make sure he could actually see Stephen Decatur. Well, unfortunately, he did see Stephen Decatur. And at the end of the duel, what Barron did was what the Royal Navy and the Barbary pirates could never do, and that is kill Stephen Decatur. Stephen Decatur's last words, one of our great naval heroes, was, "Farewell, Barron." Well, Gore's answer that he actually made to Erving was unlikely to satisfy him. So the second step in the whole process, of course, was going to be the answer of the person accused of insulting somebody. And Gore did admit to Upshaw II, and he put this in writing as well, that he had written Eustace about Erving. He couldn't really deny that. "Yes, I did write my friend Eustace about you, about Erving. But I'm not sure I used the exact words that Smith said to Christie that I used." So what Christie said to Erving in his letter was that, according to Gore, Erving, you are guilty of inattention to duty, conceit, and want of knowledge. And if you remember, back when I was talking about the letters to Eustace, what Gore had actually said was Erving was guilty of ignorance, pride, and conceit. And you're saying to yourself, what's the difference? Which, of course, is precisely the point. There's no difference. But that allowed Gore to say, I don't think I quite used those words, but he didn't deny the substance of it. And then he added a little bit of insult to injury when he said, I can't really give you a full response now because I'm a member of the board. You got business to do. I'm going to go do the business. I'll get back to you later. In other words, affirming the point that Gore thought Erving was lazy. And he put that in a letter as well to Upshaw II back to Erving. And that, of course, was going to do anything but resolve this. That was just going to make Erving angry. This was no way to respond in any way that would satisfactorily explain this or be in any way satisfactory to Erving. And so the next step now is perhaps a fuller response from Gore after he's done with his business, after the board has stopped meeting. And what he could have done here is what he, I think, basically wanted to do, and what his second, the man who would be his second, William Pinckney, also a member of the board, member of the Maritime Commission, advised him to do. What he should have done, wanted to do, was simply say, I said what I said, you can challenge me, but I'm not going to accept. He could have just refused the duel. And the reason he could have done that, first of all, he didn't believe in duels, but second, after all, he was a member of the Maritime Commission. He had a very important position in London, as did Erving. How would it look to the British if one of our most important people in London, Gore, was fighting a duel with another one of our most important people in London, Erving, the country was divided already, almost hopelessly so. This would signify to the British that maybe that division wasn't just a matter of politics in Washington, but extended beyond the Atlantic. We would look terrible if our diplomats were fighting each other in a duel. And Pinckney II told Gore, look, if it comes to that, just refuse. You cannot fight a duel. You'll look terrible. We'll all look terrible if you fight a duel. And it could have been resolved that way, but the problem was if you just let it go that way without any further correspondence, there was a real risk because they don't really know what kind of a character Erving is. If you were challenged to a duel after you'd insulted somebody, which Gore had, and you refused, the danger was what would happen to you is what happened to poor Christopher Ellery. That same year, 1803, senator from Rhode Island, who accused Senator John Rutledge of a forgery. Rutledge, astoundingly, took some offense at that, being accused of being a forger, and demanded satisfaction from Ellery. While Ellery, Rhode Islander, didn't believe in duels, Ellery said, no, I'm not going to fight a duel with you. So here's what you would do, maybe, if somebody wouldn't fight a duel with you. You've been insulted. They're not giving you satisfaction. So what do? What you could do is what Rutledge did. He found Ellery at a tavern in Port Tobacco, Maryland, just a few days after all this happened. And when he went up to Ellery and he reached over and he pulled Ellery's nose. And he said, look, everybody, I pulled the scoundrel's nose. And then he reached around Ellery and began twisting his ear. And then he said to everybody else, look, I'm twisting the scoundrel's ear. And then Rutledge took a cane out and began beating Ellery on the forehead. It could have been much worse. The innkeeper showed up to separate them, but not before Ellery had managed to bite Rutledge, actually bit his arm or something. But that was the only injury that Rutledge suffered. So you could be assaulted that way, which would make you look awful. That you would allow yourself that humiliation, somebody pulling your nose. You wouldn't want that to happen under any circumstances. More commonly, as you see up here, what could happen if you refused a duel was that the person who had challenged you and you refused would take out what was called a card in the newspaper, posting you, as they put it, as a scoundrel, a coward, a poltroon. That was very common back then. So you're not going to fight me? Okay, I'm going to tell everybody you're a coward. So everybody knows. So you take an ad out of the newspaper, something like that, as you might be able to read for yourself. This is what actually happened to a lawyer named Joseph Strong in New York. Joseph Strong was upset with a lieutenant in the Navy named Renshaw. And Strong had called Renshaw in Manhattan a rascal. Renshaw heard that Strong called him a rascal. Renshaw wrote to Strong, did you call me a rascal? Strong said, yes, I did. Renshaw said, okay, you'll be hearing from my second. Strong said, I'm not going to fight you. Yeah, I'm a lawyer. You're in the Navy. I'm absolutely not going to fight you. Just forget it. So Renshaw posted him, quote, in the New York papers as an infamous, evasive coward and a scoundrel. Now, a posting could really hurt your public reputation, but only if the person doing the posting themselves had a reputation. Erving himself had a good reputation, so a posting might hurt Gore if Erving did that, should Gore refuse a challenge. He had to worry about that. But I bet a lot of you know the most famous example of a posting done by somebody who had no reputation to lose, which is why everybody ignored it. And who am I talking about? General James Wilkinson. Talk about a scoundrel. General James Wilkinson posted John Randolph of Virginia because he wouldn't fight a duel with him as a prevaricating, base, calumniating scoundrel, poltroon, and coward. But that didn't matter because everybody knew that Wilkinson was as thoroughgoing a scoundrel as ever drew breath. Having skimmed the money off the top,
in his capacity as quartermaster for the Continental Army, having plotted against George Washington, having taken $2,000 a year to betray his country at the hands of the Spanish in the early part of the 19th century, profited by speculating in sugar while on the public payroll, conspired with Aaron Burr to break up the United States, only to turn around and betray Burr when it suited him. That was Wilkinson. Everybody knew he had no character. So when he posted Randolph as a scoundrel, nobody cared. So that was one thing that could happen. But if Erving posted Gore as a coward and a scoundrel, that goes in the London newspapers, and that would, within a couple of months, show up at the Independent Chronicle in Boston. And Gore, in 1803, when all this was going on, was planning to go back to Boston. He was going to be a lawyer. And this is not going to make him look good in Boston if he's posted and he puts up with it as a coward and a scoundrel. So that's a danger he was now going to have to worry about. And by the way, that word poltroon, if anybody called you a poltroon, duel. You can't put up with that. Somebody calls you a poltroon, never put up with that. Poltroon comes from the Italian word poltrone, meaning coward, but its origins go all the way back to Latin, the word polis, or chicken. And that gives us the word poultry, the same root as poltroon, poultry, chicken. So if you call somebody a poltroon, calling them a chicken, and it's time to start talking to a second when that would happen. So at any rate, Gore has already written Erving that I'm busy. We'll talk about it later. I might have said something about that. I don't think I used the exact phrase. Nothing about this is going to be satisfactory to Erving. But after talking to Pinckney, his friend in the Maritime Claims Commission, who is now going to act as a second, Gore now wrote a second message to Erving, and maybe a little bit better, because what Gore said in the second message, and he and Pinckney are really trying to avoid any further trouble here. What Gore said in the second message was, look, I might have used some expressions that you don't like in my letters to Eustace, but I was commenting on your official capacity. I wasn't having anything to say about your character as a gentleman, your trustworthiness. He didn't say that. I'm basically saying you're terrible at your job. Well, he didn't put it that way. But he said that I have a right, because I'm an official person in London, I've got a right to comment on your professional ability. And what he said in that letter was, I am prepared, if need be, to vindicate and justify my negative opinion of you. I'll vindicate and justify it if you want me to, before political authorities, perhaps. But maybe that would be a way out of this if Erving would accept that distinction between professional criticism and criticism of your character as a gentleman. They're two different things. Maybe that was a way out of it. And it might have been a way out of it. And William Pinckney thought this might work. That's the value of a good second. I think this advice came from Pinckney. You want to, in your second letter, put it a little more nicely. And the other thing that Pinckney did, really important, was as soon as he delivered the second letter to Erving, he went to see the brand new American minister just arrived in London, who was, fresh from his triumph and taking all the credit for the Louisiana Purchase, James Monroe. So James Monroe had just arrived in London. Pinckney went to Monroe and said, Erving is causing trouble here. You should know about it. Monroe, Pinckney understood, the new American minister, had a lot to do. He had to negotiate a new treaty with the British, maybe stopping impressment of our sailors. The last thing Monroe would want is the American community looking terrible by being the center of a duel between two of our most important representatives. So Monroe told Pinckney, whatever Erving does, I promise that I will try to see a way out of this. I'm going to try to avoid this too. So that was very smart. So first we have another letter, maybe to soothe Erving's feathers a little bit. And then we have Pinckney talking to Monroe, which might be a way somehow out of this if Monroe can use his influence. So eventually, Erving is going to get this second letter, and it looked like it actually might work. Maybe Erving would walk away. And Erving actually told Pinckney, could you just have Gore change one little phrase in the letter? Gore had said, I'm prepared to vindicate and justify my criticisms of Erving. And what Erving asked was, can you ask Gore to just change that a little bit? Instead of vindicate and justify, what about prove and support? That doesn't sound so bad. If he makes that change, maybe we can get out of this somehow. Maybe my honor will be saved. And Pinckney was thrilled about this. And he went back to Gore and said, that's fine, we'll make the change. And that could well be a way out of it. Unfortunately, I don't know why. I'd love to know why. But after sending that conciliatory note, just change the wording a little bit, Erving seems to have woken up the next day and changed his mind again. And he wrote another letter to Gore through Upshaw. And in this letter, according to Erving, Gore's statements to Eustis are, quote, false, malicious, insolent libel. However Gore might want to parse them or explain them, it's still a libel. You insulted me to people who mattered. I need to defend my character, my reputation. You call me lazy, conceited, that's my character. Not just my professional job performance, that's my character. There was no more explaining to be done. Erving wasn't going to put up with it. And the last thing Erving said in that note was ominous. My friend Upshaw will arrange the rest. That's a challenge. Gore was now challenged to a duel. That's what that meant. Gore and Pinckney now had to think of something. And they still decided, there's no way that you can fight a duel. It's going to make us all look bad. Your professional character will not permit you to sacrifice the interests of your country, sacrifice the image of your country by fighting a duel with a fellow American diplomat. You can't do it. So Gore heard that from Pinckney. Gore believed that to be true anyway. And so this is the response that ultimately Erving would get. And it's Pinckney talking in the voice of Christopher Gore. The course in which Mr. Erving manifestly aims is wholly admissible. Any duel will be wholly irreconcilable with the official relationship between Gore and Erving. Gore's duties to the Maritime Claims Board forbid any such thing as accepting a challenge. I simply can't fight a duel with you. Monroe, at this point, agreed with his conduct, so they now go to Monroe. They align him on the side of what they really want to do, which is find a way to avoid the duel. And when Erving issued the challenge, as I just said, these were the exact words Gore finally gave. Upon mature reflection, the proposal contained in the note, I am convinced that my character and my official duties forbid my acceding to the appeal you have proposed. So that's the official rejection of the challenge. So I'm not going to fight a duel with you. That's what Gore said to Erving. But everything comes down to that. And this is the beauty of the whole thing. This is why I think the story is so interesting. Remember what a good second Pinckney was. He got Monroe involved pretty early in this over the last few days. What Gore also said through Pinckney in his note to Erving was that although I refuse your challenge, I will fight a duel with you if representatives of our country here in London, people in respectable situations, think that a duel would be consistent with American interests. So if they think otherwise, if they think I can consistently with my duties as Maritime Claims Commissioner fight a duel with you, I'll do it. This is what Gore said, I will cheerfully accede to your request. Now, when in this letter, Gore and Pinckney mentioned people in respectable situations, don't be misled by the plural. They only met one person, and that was James Monroe. If Monroe, in the end, will allow this, we'll fight the duel. If he won't allow it, we won't. The ball was now in Monroe's court. See how brilliant this was. Gore would now have a way to avoid a duel and maintain his reputation as a gentleman concerned about his character, because it's not him running away, it's Monroe enforcing order and telling them both, you cannot fight a duel. But that would also give a way for Erving to back down. Because if he's forbidden by Monroe, his boss, what can he do? And under those circumstances, now that Gore has refused a duel, Surely Erving could not post Gore as a coward, knowing that his boss Monroe was the one who forbid the duel. And everybody can now go home and stay alive. That's the beauty of the whole idea. Pinckney, Gore, and the third American on the commission, John Trumbull, the painter, now went to see Monroe. And very predictably, Monroe told them, absolutely not. You can't fight a duel. It's inconsistent with your professional character. I won't have it. You can tell Erving the same thing. John Trumbull now enters our story, the man who up to this point was making a reputation painting people who died in battle, Warren dying at Bunker Hill, Montgomery dying at Quebec, Mercer dying at Princeton. And now he got to prevent a death by helping to persuade Monroe that he had to call a halt to this whole thing, honor intact for everybody. Now, Monroe, luckily for everybody in this story, knew all about duels, didn't particularly like duels, almost fought a duel with Alexander Hamilton. A lot of you know this story. Remember when Hamilton was found to be engaged in an adulterous affair with Maria Reynolds, and he actually paid hush money to Maria Reynolds' husband. And that got to be public, of course, a few years later, making Hamilton look terrible. And Hamilton accused Monroe of being responsible for the leak. Monroe said, I didn't leak that information. Hamilton, to Monroe's face, said, that is totally false. Monroe, to Hamilton's face, said, you are a scoundrel. Hamilton said to Monroe's face, I will meet you like a gentleman. Meaning, of course, now they're going to open fire at each other. I'm ready, Monroe said, get your pistols. However, luckily, Pistol said, but I need 3 months. I got to put my affairs in order. I need 3 months to do it. And the great thing about that is 3 months go by, maybe you forget what you were mad at. And Hamilton eventually didn't want to fight a duel with Monroe because things were getting out of hand with France. Hamilton wanted to come in the army that would be raised to fight the French by 1798, the next year. And he felt that a duel would be inconsistent with the possibility of him being named to command an army. And so he kind of wanted to back down. Madison spoke to Monroe. Madison said, this is stupid. The whole thing's ridiculous. Everybody knows about Maria Reynolds now anyway. Hamilton himself wrote a pamphlet about it. So why are you fighting a duel? And on Hamilton's decision to accept Monroe's explanation and Madison's decision to clod Monroe into a good explanation, the whole thing fizzled out. So Monroe knew about these affairs of honor, and he knew that there'd be some real force behind any determination of him that this duel must not take place. And so it didn't. Monroe, I think, remembered Madison's good advice, how actually to avoid something like this getting out of hand. He acted on it. And the very last thing that happened to make sure there was no duel was that when Monroe's decision was conveyed to Erving, Pinckney and Trumbull both let him know Monroe was forbidding the duel. It's not going to happen. Just forget about it. Pinckney also told Erving, if somehow you get it in your head to issue the challenge again and to demand satisfaction no matter what Monroe said, if you actually do that, then I, Pinckney, will go get the nearest constable and have you arrested. Which means there's no way there's ever going to be a duel. Pinckney, perfect second. What a great second. And so there's no posting, there's no duel. Everything ended after that. I did want to say, though, the significance of all this, to me, parallels what Gore was doing in London in the first place. What does all this have to say? That if you got an affair of honor, and A won't back down, and B won't back down, B offers no good explanation, A doesn't accept what B said, now we're going to be shooting pistols at one another. It's all senseless, it's all silly. But it's all because nobody wants to back down. But what if there was a neutral party who would decide if a duel really ought to take place? Was this really an insult? Was the explanation really no good? Which is exactly what Gore and Pinckney were doing in London in the first place. An arbitration commission, British and American, based upon fair rules, deciding what kind of money American and British merchants deserved, based upon mutual depredations on their commerce during the 1790s. So a neutral board deciding based upon fair principles whether this really was an affair of honor
could well prevent this sort of thing. And that's what James Monroe had done. In effect, he was his own board of arbitration. There's no reason for a duel. Let's not have a duel. And in fact, there was precedent for this, and it had to do with the Navy. And the Navy was ground zero of duels in American life. You're like 14 years old. Your ambition is to be in a duel. Best thing to do is join the Navy because there are lots of duels in the Navy, and they were mostly stupid. Like this one, it's 1807. Midshipman Reddick comes down for dinner in the little sloop of war where everybody happens to be, and Reddick is wearing his hat. Barrymore, another midshipman, says to Reddick, "Take your hat off." It is ungentlemanly to wear a hat. Reddick said, "I don't want to take my hat off. I want nothing further to do with you, Barrymore." Later, other midshipmen went to Reddick and said, "You can't let him tell you to take your hat off. You've got to challenge him to a duel." So Reddick challenged Barrymore to a duel. Barrymore was severely wounded, all because somebody didn't like him telling them to take the hat off. But my favorite example, and everybody's favorite example of duels, has to do with the great naval hero, Lieutenant Richard Somers. One afternoon, there he is about to enjoy mess with his shipmates. And down the stairs comes his fellow lieutenant back then, Stephen Decatur. Stephen Decatur and Richard Somers were childhood friends. They were the best of friends. And they would call each other fun names. So Decatur called Richard Somers, "Hello, old fool." And Somers thought nothing of it. That's just what Decatur called him. But then later on, after dinner, 5 fellow officers of Richard Somers would not drink wine with him. And Somers said, "Why won't you pour wine with me?" And they said, "Because you're a coward. Decatur called you an old fool. You didn't challenge him to a duel. You can't put up with that." So what Somers did was say, "Fine, I challenge all 5 of you to a duel." And he wasn't kidding. All 5 would fight a duel with Somers on the same day. And they'd be separated by an hour. Duel, 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 duel. Decatur went to Somers and said, you can't fight a duel over this. I'll fight a duel with those idiots. Let me fight the duel." Decatur didn't believe in dueling, but he was willing to do it because Somers was a good friend. Somers said, "No, it's my quarrel. They called me a coward. I got to fight a duel with them." So the first duel took place, and the officer who was dueling with Somers shot him in the arm. And that should have been the end of it. But then Somers said, "No, I'll be okay. I want to fight the next duel." So in the second duel, Somers was hit in the thigh. So duel number 1, he's hit here. Duel number 2, he's hit there. And Decatur said, you want, maybe I can take over now? But no, Somers said, "I'm going to fight the third duel." So what Decatur did was he lifted Somers up and he put him in a chair. Somers was still bleeding from the thigh wound. He couldn't stand. And Somers fought the duel from the chair. And luckily, nobody was hit in the third duel. And then the fourth guy said, "Well, I apologize. Maybe we shouldn't fight a duel anymore over this." But the reason I bring that up is the US Navy, after this idiocy with Lieutenant Somers, actually established a system. And the system didn't last for very long, but it was an honor board. And if you were cruising on the high seas and you had a quarrel with a fellow officer, you wouldn't just automatically challenge them to a duel. The idea was you go before this board. And the officers above you would say, "We think this is an affair of honor. Maybe there should be satisfaction." But they were much more likely to say, "Work it out amongst yourselves, maybe a reprimand, maybe an apology. But we don't believe dueling is good for the Navy, and we think you should find a way out of this short of violence." And that is the great virtue of arbitration, of course. If you got a quarrel that might otherwise end in something pretty harmful and hostile and dangerous, don't you need neutral parties with neutral principles to find a way out of it and deliver a verdict that both sides can live with? And that's why arbitration really, despite the fact that it doesn't make the headlines, succeeds very often around the world to this day. There's a big dispute right now about rights to the Indus Valley watershed between India and Pakistan. That's something pretty serious. Why fight about that? Why not try to work it out according to known principles? That's what the Permanent Court of Arbitration is doing right now. That's the precedent established by Gore's court in London beginning in 1796. And that's also what I think saved potentially Gore's and Erving's life when James Monroe acted as his own arbitration commission. Forget about this, it's not worth it. Let's not fight a duel. And because of that, Gore lived to go home and build the Gore Place and eventually become governor of Massachusetts. Eustis himself became governor of Massachusetts also for a while. And George Erving, who at every point in this story knew that the last thing he could possibly ever get away with is defying James Monroe. James Monroe was the coming Republican. James Monroe probably going to be president someday. They knew that in 1803. So the last thing Erving ever wanted to do was defy James Monroe, which is part of the reason this all worked out so peacefully. And because it was worked out peacefully, Erving became a very accomplished diplomat and devoted 20 years of the next part of his life to serving our country abroad in Denmark, Spain, and also I think Prussia for a while. And so the story has a happy ending. The duel didn't occur. And we also have another object lesson in the value of arbitration. So that's the presentation. And thank you for this. Now here's what I wanted to ask. There's a bunch of Christopher Gore experts in the audience. Have you heard about the George Erving altercation? Because I have never read about this in any other source.